The deal closed at 7:43 in the evening. Walter Ainsley knew the exact time. He had been watching the clock on the conference room wall the way a captain watches the horizon from the deck of his ship. Not staring, just aware. The slow travel of the minute hand was a kind of quiet music underneath everything else, the way the passage of time had always been to him. He had learned long ago that time is the one thing a man cannot earn back. You can rebuild money. You can rebuild a reputation. You cannot rebuild a single hour once it is gone. So he kept his eye on it the way he kept his eye on everything that mattered. Quietly. Completely. When the last signature landed on the last page, the attorneys on both sides of the long table exchanged a look. It was the look that means a thing is real now. A thing that cannot be undone. Walter felt the old familiar satisfaction settle into his chest, low and steady. It was not joy exactly. Joy was loud and unreliable. This was quieter than joy, and it lasted longer. It was the feeling of a thing concluded, the deep and private weight of a job finished clean. 22 floors below Chicago was doing what Chicago does on a cold October night. Moving fast. Collars turned up against the dark. The wind came off the lake with that particular meanness it carries in autumn, the kind of wind that reminds a man the city was built where the land allowed it and not the other way around. Walter knew that wind. He had grown up with a smaller version of it in a town in Ohio where the cold came down hard and honest every November, and nobody complained because complaining changed nothing. But the town had never been built to a scale that made the wind interesting. It just blew through and people leaned into it, and the years passed. He had left that place at 18 years old with $400 folded in his pocket and one very specific idea about the kind of life he intended to build. That was 53 years ago, and now here he stood, 71 years old, a trimmed gray beard he had worn for 2 decades, standing in a glass conference room near the top of a building his own company had raised out of the bare ground. The idea he had carried out of Ohio had become by every measure a man could name real. You could touch it. You could see it from the street. He shook hands around the table. 14 people, 14 handshakes, each one measured to the man receiving it. Firm with the lawyers who respected force and distrusted softness. A little warmer with the men he had built the deal alongside the partners who had stayed in the room through the hard middle of the thing when it would have been easier to walk. He gave each one of them that particular grip that passes between two men who have just agreed on something large and who both understand that the agreement is the beginning of the work and not the end of it. He had always been good at this. He had been good at it since his very first deal more than 40 years ago, a small commercial property he had bought with borrowed money and sold 18 months later for twice what he paid. The handshake at that first closing had taught him something he never forgot. There is a specific feeling that comes when a thing you built with your own 2 hands becomes real in the world, when it stops being an idea inside your skull and starts standing on its own out where other people can lean against it. Most men chase that feeling their whole lives and never once give it a name. Walter had named it early, and he had spent half a century chasing it down. A woman appeared at his shoulder as the room began to empty out. Marlene Voss, his assistant. She had been with him for 11 years, and in that time she had become something a man does not often find and does not often deserve. She managed the space between Walter and the world. She anticipated, she filtered, she smoothed the rough edges off his days so completely and so quietly that he had long ago stopped noticing she was doing it at all. Which was, he understood, the highest proof that she was doing it well. "The car's at the curb," she said. "Harlan's already downstairs. You've got nothing until 9 tomorrow, so there's no rush on." "I'm going straight home," Walter said. He said it the way he said most things. Already decided. He brought the same plain finality to leaving a room that he brought to entering one. "Tell the team dinner is on me tonight. Put it on the account at the place on Michigan." Marlene smiled. It was the smile of a person who has just been told to do something she already considers a good idea. "Already done," she said. "I figured." He went down in the elevator with Harlan Price, his chief of security. Harlan was 54 years old and built like a man who had taken the job of being physically formidable seriously for 30 years and had never once let it slide. He had been with Walter for 9 years. He spoke the way competent men speak when they have nothing left to prove. Not silent, not cold. Just careful with his words in a way Walter had come to understand as a form of respect, the way a craftsman is careful with good wood. The hotel lobby downstairs was still busy. The day's conference had let out, and the attendees stood in those loose clusters that form after long events. People who have spent a whole day being agreeable, now slowly turning back into themselves, loosening ties, checking phones, deciding where the evening would go. Walter moved through them the way he had learned to move through crowds across half a century of doing it. Not coldly, just with a forward motion that made it clear he was going somewhere, which made the strangers around him decide without quite knowing they had decided not to slow him down. The revolving door turned, and the night took him. The cold hit him full in the face, that lake wind coming straight off the black water with the whole force of October behind it. He reached up and turned his collar against it, and somewhere in the back of his mind he registered that this was a cleaner kind of cold than the overheated room he had just left. The way the truth is, sometimes a cleaner thing than comfort. The black SUV was at the curb, exactly where it always was. Tony, his driver, had spent 7 years learning the precise art of being in the right place at the right moment, and he had it down now to something close to instinct. Two of Harlan's men stood flanking the vehicle, watching the street, the way men watch a street when watching is the whole of their job. Walter reached for the car door. That was when the boy appeared. He came from the left, from the edge of the crowd that was still drifting along the sidewalk in the slow current of people leaving the building. And he was moving against that current. That was the first thing that registered in the back of Walter's mind. A small figure cutting the wrong way through a river of grown men in long dark coats, moving with a purpose so single and so sharp that the security men felt it before Walter did, because feeling such things first was exactly what they were paid for. The two men at the SUV moved. It was not violent. Harlan had trained a team that understood the difference between stopping a man and attacking one, and the difference showed in everything they did. But it was certain, a shift of weight, a closing of space. It would have become a solid wall if the boy had taken one more step. He did not take one more step. He stopped at the very edge of that invisible line and stood there with his chest heaving. He had the look of someone who has been running far longer than is comfortable and who has finally arrived at the place he was running toward before his body has caught up to the fact of his arrival. He was 10 years old, 11 at the very most. His clothes told a story all by themselves. A jacket that had lost its warmth and its color somewhere a long way back faded down to something between gray and brown. Jeans worn clean through at both knees in the way of a boy who is hard on his clothes because the world has been hard on him. A pair of sneakers, one of them split open at the toe in a way that must have been letting the cold straight in against the skin of his foot. His face was the face of a child who was frightened and who had decided somewhere along the way that being frightened was not going to be allowed to stop him. "Mr. Ainsley," the boy said. The name came out the way a thing comes out when a person has been repeating it over and over inside his own head. Practiced, held on to carefully. The name of the right man said with great precision so as not to get it wrong when the moment he had been running toward finally came. Walter had stopped. He could not have told you exactly when he stopped. Somewhere between the boy appearing and the boy saying his name, some quiet calculation had finished itself inside him, and the result was stillness. He was not reaching for the door anymore. His hand had come back down to his side without his telling it to. Harlan was at his shoulder. "Sir," Harlan said, "let's keep moving." "Hold on," Walter said. He was not looking at Harlan. He was looking at the boy. The boy was breathing hard, but he held Walter's eyes with a directness that grown men rarely manage. There was no calculation in it, no working out of how to seem, how to be received, what face to put on. He was simply looking at the one thing he had come all this way to look at, the way a man dying of thirst looks at water. "Please, sir," the boy said. His voice was trying to be steady. It was mostly succeeding. "There are men inside your house." His voice dropped on those last words. Not because his courage was running out, because of something older than fear, the instinct of a person who knows he is saying something dangerous and lowers his voice the way you cup your hand around a candle in a wind. "They're waiting for you." Around them, the world kept moving. The conference crowd drifted on toward dinners and drinks and ordinary evenings. The traffic hummed. The wind came off the lake with the same cold indifference it had carried for 10,000 years before any of them were born. But in the small space around Walter Ainsley, nothing moved. Not Harlan, not the two men at the SUV, not Tony behind the wheel who had turned in his seat and gone very still. Walter looked at the boy. He looked at him with the full and undivided attention he had spent a lifetime learning to give to the things that earned it. The attention of a man who had sat across 1,000 tables and trained himself to sense the moment when a person's words and a person's true position were not the same thing. And what he saw now was not the face of a boy who was lying. It was the face of a boy carrying something far too heavy to hold alone, who had run a very long way to set it down at last in front of the one person it belonged to. "What's your name?" Walter said. "Caleb." The boy swallowed. "Caleb Ridgway." "Caleb." Walter said it slowly, the way you say a name you intend to remember. "Who told you this?" "Nobody told me." The boy lifted his chin a little. "I saw it myself." For a long moment, the 71-year-old man and the 10-year-old boy simply looked at each other on a cold sidewalk in Chicago, while a city full of strangers walked past without seeing either of them. Then Walter turned to Harlan. "We're going back inside." They moved back through the revolving door into the warmth and the light, and Harlan secured a small meeting room off the main corridor with a quiet, practiced efficiency that took less than 4 minutes. One of his men took the door. Harlan himself stood near the wall, arms loose at his sides, his whole attention pointed at the room like the beam of a lamp. Walter sat down across a small table from the boy. Caleb sat with his hands flat on his knees. His worn jacket was still damp at the shoulders from the weather he had run through. He looked smaller in the steady indoor light than he had out on the dark street, the way frightened things often look smaller once they are finally somewhere safe. Walter got him a glass of water, and then after a moment's thought, he went out to the service station in the corridor still stocked from the evening's event and came back with a plate of food. He set it down in front of the boy. Caleb looked at the plate, and in that single look there were several things at once. Hunger plainly, but also pride. And underneath both of those, a flicker of uncertainty, as if accepting food from this man might mean owing something he could not pay back. Then he ate. He ate the way a person eats when he has learned the hard way never to take a meal for granted. Quickly, efficiently, with his eyes half down and his free hand resting near the plate as if to guard it. And while he ate, he talked. And Walter Ainsley listened. It was a thing Walter knew how to do perhaps better than anything else he knew. In rooms where deals were made and broken, he had learned that the man who listens completely holds more power than the man who fills the air with words. He gave the boy his whole attention. He did not interrupt. He let the story come at its own pace, in its own order, and he watched it arrive piece by piece the way you watch weather come in across open water. The boy had been sleeping for the past 6 weeks in an abandoned maintenance building at the edge of the woods behind Walter's estate in Winnetka. Walter knew the building, or he had known of it once a long time ago. It was a relic from the original construction back when the property was first developed. It had held grounds equipment until a newer building made it useless, and then it had simply been left behind. The trees had grown in close around it over the long years. It had become invisible from the main house. And the boy explained without quite explaining it, invisible from the property records too, because nobody had come to tear it down or even to look at it in all the weeks Caleb had been living there. He had found it the way children who need shelter learn to find shelter. Quietly, carefully, by paying attention to the forgotten margins of places that grown men had stopped looking at years ago. From that little building, through a gap in the trees that the original planting had left and never closed, there was a clear line of sight to a service road. The road ran along the eastern edge of the estate. It led to a gate that was separate from the main entrance, used by the grounds crews, secured not by a guard, but by a keypad and a code. 3 nights ago, Caleb said he had been awake late. He slept lightly. Children who sleep in unsafe places learn to. And he had seen a black SUV come through that service gate after midnight. The gate had opened without any alarm. No challenge, no light. The vehicle had pulled in near the service entrance of the main house, and 3 men had climbed out into the cold. They had carried cases, hard-sided cases large, the kind a man carries when he knows exactly what is inside and exactly what it weighs and handles it with the steadiness of someone who has carried it many times before. Caleb had watched them go into the house. 2 hours later, a second vehicle came. 2 more men. The next night, the same thing. A different car, the same gate, The same silence. No alarm, no guard, no one stopping any of it. On the third night, Caleb had moved closer, not inside the fence. He had understood with the hard sense of a child who has learned to measure danger correctly, because measuring it wrong has cost him before, that inside the fence was not a place he could go. But close enough there in the dark at the tree line to catch a few words between two men who had stepped outside for a minute. He could not hear everything, but he heard the name, Walter Ainsley. He heard the words by Friday night, and he heard clear and unmistakable a low laugh, and then a sentence he had carried with him every hour since. He'll never walk through that house again. Walter sat very still. Friday was 2 days away. Caleb had not gone to the police. He laid this out plainly without apology, the way a man lays out a decision he has already finished making and is not going to relitigate. He was 10 years old. He was sleeping in an abandoned building on another man's land with no identification, no guardian standing beside him, and no good reason to believe the police would hear his story as a warning rather than treat him as a problem to be cleaned up and moved along. He had thought about it. He had turned it over. And he had decided with the cold, practical sense of a boy who had already seen with his own eyes what institutions did and did not do with people like him, that the police were not his most reliable door. So he had carried it. For 3 days he had carried what he knew alone. He had kept watching the service road. He had gathered whatever more came within his reach. And he had tried by himself to work out what a 10-year-old boy could possibly do with the knowledge that men were going to kill a stranger by Friday night. And then the day before, he had been walking through downtown Chicago. He had an errand near the shelter where his grandmother was staying. And he passed a hotel entrance with a large screen mounted outside, playing coverage of a business conference. And on that screen was a face he knew. Not in person. He had never seen Walter Ainsley with his own eyes. But he had seen that face on the television in the shelter common room, on the covers of the magazines at the public library, where he sometimes spent his afternoons staying warm and out of the wind. And when he stopped and looked up at that screen, two things became true at the same moment. This was the man whose name he had heard whispered in the dark, and this was the place where that man was right now. So he ran, 14 blocks, through the cold and the traffic and the crowd, because he had decided after 3 days of turning it over that a thing he could actually do tonight was worth more than a perfect plan he could not. Walter let the story finish. He let the silence sit a moment after the last word, the way you let a heavy door close gently rather than slamming it. Then he looked up at Harlan. Harlan's face had changed. It was the face of a man performing a calculation he had been hoping would come out differently and watching it come out exactly the way he had feared it would. The service gate code was changed 8 weeks ago, Harlan said. His voice was level and quiet. Standard rotation. 3 people have the current code. He paused. Me, Marlene, and Garrett. Garrett was Garrett Holloway, the estate manager. He had been with Walter for 6 years. Walter looked down at the table for a long moment. The numbers were already arranging themselves in his mind the way numbers always had, falling into their places without his asking, and he did not like the shape they were making. Then he looked back at the boy. You watched for 3 nights, he said. You saw all this, and you waited 3 nights before you came to me. Why? Caleb met his eyes without flinching. I wanted to be sure, he said. I didn't want to tell you something that wasn't true. Walter held the boy's gaze. Something in his chest moved that had not moved in a long while. How did you know it was my house? He asked. How did you know the name belonged to me? I saw your name on the gate, Caleb said. The main gate, Ainsley. And when I heard the men say it, I knew they were talking about you. Walter nodded slowly. The third night, he said. How many men did you see altogether? Caleb thought about it, and the way he thought about it told Walter a great deal. He did not guess. He did not round off. He counted the way a boy counts when he has learned from hard experience that being wrong about a number can hurt him. 3 the first night, Caleb said. 2 the second. 4 the third. He paused. One of them was there both the second and the third night. I knew him by his jacket. It was a specific color. He looked down for a second, then back up. Dark red. Across the room, Harlan made a small movement. Barely anything. A shift of his weight that another man might have missed entirely. Walter did not miss it. Harlan, he said. Harlan was quiet for a beat. When he spoke, his voice was carefully flat, the voice of a man laying down a fact he wishes he did not have to lay down. There's a man on the grounds crew who wears a red jacket, he said. Dale Whitmore. He was hired 14 months ago through a staffing agency. He paused. The agency was recommended to us by Garrett Holloway. The room went very quiet. Caleb sat watching the two men. He did not speak. He had a way of knowing exactly when to be silent, and it was not a thing children usually have to learn so young. He simply watched and listened and filed it all away somewhere behind those dark, steady eyes, the way a careful clerk files away papers he knows he will need again. Walter noticed that too. He was noticing a great many things about this boy. He sat back in his chair. The conference room with its soft hotel lighting felt very far away now from the world it belonged to. He had spent 50 years learning to sense the real shape of a thing underneath the shape it was pretending to have. And the real shape of this thing was beginning to come clear, and it was uglier than the lake wind outside. Someone in his own house had opened the gate. Someone he trusted had let them in. He looked at the boy across the table, the worn jacket, the split shoe, the plate now empty, the dark, clear eyes that had been spending their attention on things that mattered for so long that they had forgotten how to waste any of it on things that did not. A 10-year-old boy had run 14 blocks through a freezing city against the flow of a crowd of strangers to warn a man he had never met. He had asked for nothing. He was not asking for anything now. He had simply decided that what he knew was too important to keep to himself, and then he had acted on the decision. Caleb, Walter said. The boy looked up. Why did you do it? Walter asked. You don't know me. You owe me nothing. You could have kept walking and nobody in the world would ever have known. Why run all that way for a stranger? Caleb was quiet for a moment. When he answered, he did not answer the way a child reaches for something he has memorized to please an adult. He answered the way a person speaks a thing that has become part of the very way he thinks. My grandmother says that if you know something wrong is about to happen and you stay quiet, the wrong becomes part of you. He paused. I didn't want it to be part of me. Walter sat with that. It went into him deeper than the boy could have known. Because once, a long time ago, Walter had been married to a woman who said things exactly like that. Not as lectures, not as instruction, just as plain statements of how the world was spoken, with the quiet certainty of a person who has decided what she believes and feels no need to argue for it, because to her, it is simply true, the way the cold is cold. Adeline. He had not let himself think her name in a while. She had been gone for years now, and in those years, Walter had done the one thing he knew how to do without fail. He had worked. He had worked with a focus that had built towers and closed deals and made his name larger than it had ever been before. And the work had done something else too, something he did not often allow himself to look at directly. It had filled the space where other things used to be. It had been a very effective way of not feeling the size of the quiet that waited for him every night in that big house in Winnetka. He had not thought much about boys like Caleb Ridgway, about children sleeping in cold buildings at the edges of estates like his own. That was not a comfortable thing to understand about himself sitting there in a borrowed room at 71. But Walter had never been a man who flinched from a hard fact just because it was uncomfortable to hold. He had built everything he owned by looking hard truths dead in the eye and dealing with them honestly. So he looked at this one too. Where is your grandmother now? He asked. Caleb did something small with his face. A brief inward adjustment. The look of a boy weighing a question that has gone somewhere personal and deciding how much of himself to give to it. The shelter on Wabash, he said. The one by the old church. She has a bed there. Until Friday. What happens Friday? They rotate the beds, Caleb said. After 2 weeks, you have to leave for 3 days. Then you can come back if there's room. He said it the way a man reads a regulation aloud. Flat, matter of fact. As if it were just a rule and not a hardship at all. Which was Walter understood its own particular kind of hardship, the kind that has been born so long it has stopped announcing itself as pain. Is she sick? Walter asked. A pause. Her heart, Caleb said. She takes medicine for it. He looked down at his empty plate. She doesn't know where I've really been sleeping. She thinks I've been at the shelter too. I didn't want her to worry. Walter let that settle into the room. A 10-year-old boy keeping a secret to protect his grandmother from worrying about the secret he was keeping to protect himself. The layers of it went down a long way further than a child should ever have had to build. Your grandmother, Walter said. What's her name? Oh, Eleanor, Caleb said. Eleanor Ridgway. And before the shelter, Walter said. What was she before? Caleb looked up at him. There was something in his eyes that was not quite surprise. It was closer to recognition. The boy had understood that Walter was a man who knew there had been a before, that people did not begin in shelters, that every hard place has a softer country somewhere behind it. A teacher, Caleb said. She taught second grade for 31 years. Walter nodded slowly. He was quiet for a while, looking at the boy across the table. Outside, somewhere far below the lake, wind kept up its long argument with the city. Inside the small room, a clock on the wall ticked off the seconds, and Walter Ainsley, who had spent his whole life measuring time, felt the weight of these particular seconds differently than he had felt any in years. 2 days, by Friday night, he'll never walk through that house again. The threat was real. The boy was real. The red jacket was real. And so was the gate code that only 3 people held. And so was the cold certainty settling into Walter's bones that the danger had not come from outside his life at all. It had come from inside it. It had been sitting at the very edge of his days, smiling, anticipating, smoothing the rough edges for longer than he wanted to know. He thought about the drive home he had been about to take. The car at the curb, the dark road out to Winnetka, the big house at the end of it, with its warm lights and its waiting men. He would not be taking that drive tonight. Harlan, Walter said. His voice had changed. It was the voice he used when a thing had stopped being a question and become a decision. I want everything pulled. Security footage, access logs, all of it. He paused. But not through the estate system, through the external server, the one Adeline set up years ago, the private one. Harlan looked at him for a moment and then understood. There was one system in Walter's life that had been built before Harlan's time. One system maintained separately from everything else, its records kept apart from the main security network. Adeline had insisted on it 7 years ago with that thoroughness she had brought to everything she ever touched. She had said you never build a house with only one lock. Walter had kept it running long after she was gone because taking apart something she had built felt like a particular kind of wrong he had never been ready to commit. He understood now why she had wanted it. Some part of him sitting in that small room felt her hand on his shoulder across all the years between them. The redundancy she had insisted on. The second lock she had built on the day everyone told her one was plenty. She had never believed that plenty was the same as enough. She had always said that good enough was the enemy of good. Harlan already had his phone in his hand. I'll have it inside the hour, he said, and stepped toward the door. Walter turned back to the boy. Caleb had finished eating. He sat now with his hands back on his knees in the posture of someone who has done the thing he came to do and is no longer sure what his place in the room is. His task was complete, his purpose spent. And a boy who has spent his purpose does not always know what he is allowed to want next. Walter looked at him for a long moment. He thought about the long, narrow years since Adeline died. He thought about everything he had built in that time and everything he had not. He thought about the specific way a life gets smaller when the person who made it wide is no longer in it to push the walls back out. And he thought about the fact that none of it, not one tower, not one deal, not one signature on one page, would have meant a single thing 2 nights from now. Not if a hungry 10-year-old boy in a split shoe had decided that warning a stranger was somebody else's job. Caleb, Walter said. The boy looked up. You're not going back to that building tonight. It was not a question. It was not even quite an offer. It was a man stating a thing that had simply become true somewhere in the last half hour, without him deciding it, so much as discovering it already there. Caleb watched him with those steady, careful eyes, the eyes of a boy who had learned to be suspicious of kindness, because kindness in his experience often came with a price tag he could not afford. And your grandmother, Walter said, before the boy could find a way to refuse, is not going to lie awake tonight wondering where you are. We're going to take care of that too. Harlan paused at the door, the phone at his ear, and looked back at the two of them. The old man with the gray beard and the 10-year-old boy in the worn-out jacket sitting across a small table from each other in a borrowed room, while somewhere out in the dark, a clock counted down toward Friday night. Walter Ainsley had walked out of that hotel an hour ago, a man who had everything. He understood now that he had very nearly had nothing at all. And the only reason he was still sitting here, still breathing, still able to feel the warmth of the room and the weight of the boy's trust, in the long, cold distance to Friday, was that a child the world had stopped seeing had refused to look away. Outside, the lake wind kept blowing. And in the small room off the corridor, Walter leaned forward, folded his hands on the table, and looked at the boy who had saved his life without yet knowing that he had done it. "Now," he said quietly, "tell me everything. One more time. From the very beginning, and don't leave anything out." The car never made the drive to Winnetka that night. Instead, Harlan moved them up to a suite on the 14th floor of the same hotel, a thing he arranged in the time it took most men to find their car keys. There was a second room beside it connected by a short interior hall, and that was where Caleb would sleep. This had not been a discussion. From the moment Walter understood what the night truly was, the boy's safety had stopped being a question and become simply a fact that the rest of the evening would be built around. By 9 o'clock, Walter had made a phone call to the shelter on Wabash. He spoke to the night director, a tired-sounding woman who had clearly handled stranger calls than this one in her time. He did not give her the whole truth. He gave her exactly as much as Eleanor Ridgway needed, and not one word more. That her grandson was safe, that he was with a friend, that he would see her in the morning. He chose each word the way a man chooses his footing on ice, because he understood that a grandmother's relationship with the truth about her grandson mattered more than the convenience of any shorter version of it. When he hung up, Caleb was watching him from the doorway between the rooms. "You didn't tell her about the men," the boy said. "No." "Why?" Walter looked at him. "Because it isn't mine to tell. It's yours. And tonight isn't the night to hand your grandmother a fear she can't do anything about. She'd lie awake with it, and it wouldn't make either of you any safer." Caleb considered this for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of a boy accepting a thing he had not expected to agree with. Harlan came in a little after 10. His face had done the thing again. The thing it did when information arrived that confirmed a fear he had been quietly carrying around all evening. He sat down at the small table by the window, set his phone face down, and folded his hands on the wood in front of him. "Adeline's server," he said. "It captured everything the main system didn't." He paused. "Or it captured everything the main system captured before somebody went in and cleaned the main system up." Walter sat very still. Out the window, the lake was a black absence beyond the lights of the shoreline. "Tell me," he said. 47 separate access events through the service gate," Harlan said. "Over the past 3 weeks, every one of them between 11 at night and 3 in the morning. Not a single alarm tripped, not once." He let that sit. "And every one of them was opened with the same code, registered to one user." "Who's?" Walter asked it, but he already knew. He could see it forming in Harlan's jaw before the man said a word. He had been able to see it if he was honest with himself since the moment Harlan named the 3 people who held the code. "Marlene," Harlan said. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Marlene Voss. 11 years. The woman who had managed the space between Walter Ainsley and the entire world, who had anticipated his needs before he had felt them himself, who had stood at his shoulder 1,000 times and handed him the right document, the right name, the right word at the right moment. The woman who had smiled at him just hours ago and told him dinner was already arranged because she had figured. Walter found that his hands were folded on the table and that he had not moved them in some time. "There's more," Harlan said. "Go on." "The footage, the nights the boy described, the vehicles, the men, the cases." Harlan paused. "It's all there on Adeline's system. I've watched it myself, the men carrying the hard cases into the house." He looked up, and for the first time that night, something close to grimness showed plainly on his face. "The cases are marked. The markings are consistent with high-end surveillance and listening equipment. Professional grade. The kind you bring in when you want a building completely documented from the inside out." "Documented," Walter said. "Before what?" Harlan held his gaze. "Before an event. The kind that needs the building's systems mapped out beforehand. Where the gas runs, where the electrical sits, where the emergency systems are. The kind of thing you'd want to know cold if you were planning to make something look like it happened all on its own." In the doorway, Caleb had gone very still. He did not speak. But Walter saw the boy's eyes move between the 2 men, taking it in, fitting it against what he had already seen with his own eyes in the dark behind the estate. "An accident," Walter said. A gas explosion, Harlan said quietly. An old house. A cold night. A malfunction in the heating system. The kind of thing that happens to big old houses every winter and gets written up as a tragedy and never gets looked at twice because on the surface, there's nothing to look at. For a long moment, nobody in the room said anything at all. Walter thought about his house. The big house in Winnetka with the third stair that creaked and the way the morning light came in low and gold through the kitchen windows. He thought about it filling silently with gas in the dark while he slept. He thought about how close he had come an hour and a half ago to climbing into a car and driving home to it. He looked at the boy in the doorway. The boy looked back at him steadily, and Walter understood with a clarity that went all the way down to the floor of him that he was alive in this room only because that child had refused to walk past a thing that was none of his business. So they were going to make it look like an accident, Caleb said. It was not really a question. He said it the way a boy states the answer to a problem he has already worked through on his own. That's what the evidence says, Harlan answered. Caleb nodded slowly, taking it in without flinching, without drama, a child who had long ago learned to feel a hard thing without letting it show in his face. Walter stood up. He went to the window and looked out at the black water for a while. When he turned back, something in him had set the way, concrete set slow at first, and then all at once. The shock had finished moving through him, and underneath it, the old machinery had begun to turn over. I want everything Adeline's system has, he said. All of it. Not just the gate logs, the communications. If they were careless enough to route any of this through the estate network, her server would have caught it. Harlan tilted his head. How sure are you? Because she built it that way, Walter said. She told me once. She said most people lock the front door and leave the windows open. She said her system would watch the windows. Something that was almost a smile crossed his face and went out again. She never believed plenty was the same as enough. Get me people who can read it. Tonight. By midnight, the suite had become something close to an operations room. Harlan had reached two people from a private digital forensics firm, a firm that had done quiet work for Walter's company before and could be trusted to keep quiet now. They came in laptops, first men second, and set up at the long table by the window. Walter had also called his personal attorney, a man named Sutton, who had been with him for 2 decades, and who, upon hearing the words listening equipment and gas line in the same sentence, had stopped asking questions and started making his own calls. And one of those calls had reached a man at the FBI. Walter's company had cooperated years before with a federal investigation into a real estate fraud scheme that had touched one of his development partners. He had cooperated fully openly and at some real cost to himself, and the agents who worked that case had not forgotten it. There was a relationship there. A line of trust built the slow way, the only way Walter had ever trusted anything or anyone. And so at midnight, a federal agent named Brenner was on the phone listening to Sutton lay out what a 10-year-old boy had seen behind an estate in Winnetka. Caleb had fallen asleep by then in the next room on top of the covers, with his split shoe still on his foot, the way a boy sleeps when he is not yet sure he is allowed to be comfortable. Walter had gone in once to check on him and stood in the doorway a while, and then come back out and told no one that he had done it. The forensics men worked through the small hours, and as they worked, the shape of the thing came clear piece by piece, and it was larger and colder and more carefully constructed than even Harlan's first report had suggested. Walter sat at the table and read it as it came. Marlene Voss had been working with a man named Sterling Vance. Walter had never met Vance face to face, but he knew the name. Vance ran a development company that had lost 3 significant contracts to Walter's firm over the past 4 years. 3 deals where Vance had bid hard and lost each loss, biting deeper than the one before it. The forensics team pulled the story together from communication records that Adeline's server had quietly captured over 14 months, and the story they assembled was a story of slow corrosion of a good thing, rotting one small surrender at a time. It had not started as murder. That was the part that sat strangest with Walter as he read it. It had started as information. 14 months ago, Marlene had begun feeding Sterling Vance pieces of what she knew. Bid strategies, timelines, the soft places in Walter's positions, an arrangement between 2 ambitious people that in the cold world Walter had lived in for half a century was almost ordinary. Betrayal of a familiar and survivable kind. But Vance's position had gone bad. The records showed it plainly in the rising desperation of the messages over time. His company was bleeding out. His financing had come at some point along the way from people whose money carried conditions that did not appear on any term sheet anywhere. And the information Marlene was feeding him had stopped being enough to keep those people patient. You did not pay back the kind of men Sterling Vance had borrowed from with quarterly contract intelligence. You paid them back with results. And the surest result, the one that would clear the board and open the contracts Vance needed to survive, was for Walter Ainsley to no longer be standing on it. "There's something here," one of the forensics men said quietly around 2 in the morning. "The encryption on these later messages. They thought it was secure." "Was it?" Walter asked. "Against the main system, yes." The man turned his laptop slightly. "But Adeline's server runs a backup capture protocol underneath the routing. It grabbed the traffic before the encryption fully sealed it. Whoever set this up didn't know that layer existed. They couldn't have. It was never in any of the documentation." Walter looked at the screen at the lines of recovered text that someone had believed would never be read by any living eye. He thought about his wife. 7 years ago, she had stood in his study and insisted on a redundant private server, and he had thought it was an unnecessary expense, and he had let her have it because he had learned over a long marriage that letting Adeline have the thing she was certain about was nearly always the right call in the end. She had said, "You build the second lock for the day you cannot imagine ever needing it." She had said it without arguing for it the way she said all the things she was sure of because to her it was simply the truth. She had been dead for years, and she was right now in the middle of this freezing night reaching across all of it to save his life a second time. Walter had to stand up and walk to the window for a moment and look out at the black water before he could trust his own face again. By 3 in the morning, the secondary players had names. Garrett Holloway, the estate manager's 6 years of service, had been the inside hand. His role had been access, the gate codes, the staff schedules, the interior layout of the estate systems, every one of which he knew, because keeping them running was his entire job. He had handed all of it to Marlene in exchange for money that the forensics team found sitting in an account he had been clumsy enough to leave a trail to. 6 years of trust sold off in pieces cheaper than any of it was worth. Dale Whitmore, the man in the red jacket, had been the outside hand. He had never really been a grounds worker at all. He had been placed 14 months ago through the staffing agency Garrett had so helpfully recommended for exactly the purpose he was now serving. He was the one who would be on the property when the time came, the one who would know which window of the night would be quiet. Walter read all of it, and as he read, the old, cold focus that had built his entire life settled fully back into place behind his eyes. He had spent 50 years learning what resources applied precisely and quickly could accomplish, in the hands of a man who had spent decades building the relationships that made precision and speed possible. He had used that knowledge to raise towers and close deals, and turn $400 into a name people recognized on sight. He had never once used it for anything like this. "Friday," he said aloud to the room. "Tomorrow night. That's their window." Harlan looked up from across the table. "Tonight's Wednesday. We've got the rest of tomorrow, and then it's Friday." "How long do they think they have?" Walter asked. "As long as you don't know," Harlan said. "Right now, the only thing keeping this on their timeline is that they think tonight ended with you in that house or on your way to it. As far as Marlene knows, you went straight home just like you told her." Walter went very still. "As far as Marlene knows," he repeated. "You told her you were going straight home," Harlan said slowly. "And then you came back inside this hotel through a side corridor, and we've kept you off every camera that feeds the estate network since. The boys' warning bought us the one thing money can't buy. They don't know we know." For a long moment, Walter said nothing. Then something moved behind his eyes, the thing that moved when a negotiation he had thought he was losing turned all at once into one he was about to win. "Then we don't tell them," he said quietly. "Not Marlene, not Garrett, not Whitmore. Nobody touches them. Nobody warns them. We let every one of them keep believing it's going exactly the way they planned it." Harlan studied him. "You want to run it to Friday?" "I want them caught with their hands on it," Walter said. "Not suspected, not investigated. Caught. I want it so clean that no lawyer Sterling Vance can buy will ever pull a single thread of it loose." He looked at Sutton, who had been listening on the phone the whole time, and at the forensics men, and out toward the dark room where a 10-year-old boy was sleeping in his shoes. They were going to make it look like an accident, Walter said. Quiet, deniable. Nothing left to investigate. A hardness came into his voice that even Harlan had rarely heard from him. We're going to do the exact opposite. We're going to make it the loudest, most documented, most undeniable thing that ever happened to them. And we have one day to build it. The night turned over into Thursday. They did not sleep, most of them. Brenner and the federal side worked their channels carefully because a move on a man like Sterling Vance with the financing Vance had behind him required papers and warrants and a kind of patience that Walter had to force himself to respect. Harlan coordinated the forensic handoff. Every file from Adeline's server copied, verified, and placed into federal hands so that nothing could ever later be called tampered with. Sutton managed the legal architecture of all of it, the careful scaffolding that would let an arrest stand up in a courtroom months down the road. And Walter, somewhere in the gray hours before dawn, went and sat in a chair in the room where Caleb slept. He did not wake the boy. He just sat there for a while in the dark, an old man watching a sleeping child breathe and turning over in his mind the strangeness of the whole thing. He had been one signature, one car ride, one open gate away from the end of everything he was. And the only barrier that had stood between him and that end had not been Harlan's 9 years of training, or the cameras, or the codes, or the whole expensive apparatus of security and money that surrounded his life like a wall. Every one of those had failed him. Every one of them had been bought or bypassed or quietly turned against him from the inside. The only thing that had not failed was a hungry boy in a torn jacket who had heard something in the dark and decided it mattered. Caleb stirred in his sleep, and Walter went still, and the boy settled again without waking. I didn't want it to be part of me. Walter sat with that for a long time. He thought about his own life, about the years since Adeline, about the focus he had poured into the work, and what that focus had quietly cost him without ever sending him the bill. About all the people at the margins of his days that he had simply never looked at, never thought about, never let himself see. Children sleeping in cold buildings behind estates like his. A grandmother with a failing heart rotating in and out of a shelter bed every 2 weeks like a tide. A whole world of people the world had stopped seeing, and that Walter, busy and successful and protected, had stopped seeing right along with everyone else. It was not a comfortable thing to understand about himself at 71 years old in the dark in a hotel room on the night after a child saved his life. But he had spent his whole life refusing to look away from things that were true, and he was not going to start now. In the morning before the sun was fully up, Caleb woke. He came to the doorway between the rooms and found Walter already dressed, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee gone cold beside him, the forensics men still bent over their screens. "Is it Friday?" the boy asked. "It's Thursday," Walter said. "We have today." Caleb came and sat across from him. He looked at the men at the table, at the glowing screens, at the careful seriousness of the room. "Did you find out who it was?" he asked. Walter looked at the boy for a moment. He had thought about whether to keep this from him the way he had kept it from the boy's grandmother. But Caleb was not Eleanor. Caleb had earned the truth 3 nights running alone in the dark with a separated shoe and a piece of knowledge too heavy for any child to carry. "Yes," Walter said. "We found out." "Somebody who works for you," Caleb said. It was not a guess. "Yes." Caleb nodded slowly the way he nodded at hard things. "It's worse when it's somebody you know," he said. "When it's a stranger, you can at least understand it. When it's somebody you trusted." He stopped and looked down at his hands. "My grandmother says the worst hurts come through the doors you left open on purpose." Walter looked at the boy for a long moment. "Your grandmother," he said quietly. "Sounds like a woman I would have liked to know." "You can meet her," Caleb said with a simple directness that caught Walter off guard. "She makes coffee that isn't very good, but it's hot." And Walter Ainsley, who had not laughed in some time, felt something loosen in his chest that was very close to it. There was one more thing the night had surfaced, and Walter had been turning it over since the forensics men first pulled it up. Buried in the recovered communications in the increasingly cornered tone of Marlene's later messages was a thread the team had very nearly missed. Marlene Voss had not started in this to kill anyone. The record showed a woman sliding message by message deeper into something she had not chosen all at once. There was a debt, a large one older than her arrangement with Vance, The kind of private financial hole that a person hides behind a competent smile for years and tells no one about. Vance had found it. Vance had used it. The early messages were the messages of a woman selling information to dig herself out of a hole. The later ones were the messages of a woman who had realized too late that the hole had a floor made of something she could not climb back up through, and that the men Vance answered to did not accept resignations. Walter read the whole thread twice. It did not soften what she had done. A boy had nearly died in a gas explosion so that Marlene Voss could settle a debt. Her own life had been put in danger, and she had chosen to trade his for it. There was no version of that Walter would ever forgive. But it complicated the thing in a way he had not expected, because the woman in those last messages was frightened, cornered, caught in a machine that had started small and grown teeth while she wasn't looking. And Walter, who had spent 50 years sensing the true position underneath the stated one, recognized something in it that he did not want to recognize. The way a person can take one reasonable-looking step and then another and look up one day to find himself standing somewhere he would never have walked to on purpose. It did not make her less guilty, but it made the whole thing sadder and larger and harder to hold cleanly in one hand. "What is it?" Harlan asked, watching his face. Walter set the pages down. "She was in trouble before any of this started," he said. "Vance found the trouble and used it as a lever. By the time it became what it became, she was already in too deep to get out the clean way." He shook his head slowly. "It doesn't change what we do. It just means there's more than one person in this who's going to lose everything before it's over." "You feel sorry for her," Harlan said. It was not quite an accusation. Walter was quiet for a moment. "No," he said finally. "I don't think I do, but I understand her, and understanding a thing is not the same as forgiving it." He looked out the window at the cold gray morning coming up over the lake. "That's a distinction I learned from a woman who's been dead 7 years, and I've never needed it more than I do today." The day moved. By noon, the federal pieces were nearly in place. Brenner had his warrants moving through the channels that warrants move through. The plan, when it finally came together, was simple in the way that the best plans always are. Nobody would touch Marlene or Garrett or Whitmore or any of it until the last possible moment. They would all be allowed to keep believing right up to the very end that Walter Ainsley had gone home Wednesday night and that the world was unfolding exactly as they had built it to unfold. And then at the right hour, all of it would come down at once. Walter spent part of the afternoon making arrangements that had nothing to do with any of that. He called the shelter on Wabash again. He spoke quietly with the night director and made certain that Eleanor Ridgway's bed would not rotate out from under her on Friday, that whatever else happened in the world, the boy's grandmother would have a place that was warm and safe and certain. He did it without telling Caleb the way Adeline would have done, a kindness quietly, structurally, so that it landed not as charity, but simply as a thing that had turned out somehow to be the case. As evening came down on Thursday, the suite grew quieter. The forensics men packed up their work, handed off to the people who would carry it into a courtroom. Brenner's people went dark into the careful silence that comes before a federal action. Harlan checked and rechecked the perimeter of their own safety with the thoroughness of a man who had let exactly nothing slip and intended to let nothing slip now. And Walter stood at the 14th floor window and looked out at the city, his city, the place he had come to 53 years ago, with $400 and one idea and nothing else at all. Behind him, Caleb sat at the table drawing something on a hotel notepad with a pen he had been given, working at it with the same complete attention he gave to everything in the world. "What are you making?" Walter asked without turning around. "The building," Caleb said. "The one I was sleeping in. Behind your house." He kept drawing. "I keep thinking about it. It was a good building. Somebody just stopped using it." Walter turned and looked at the boy bent over the notepad, the pen moving in small, sure strokes, and then he looked out again at the dark coming down over the lake. Tomorrow night was Friday. Tomorrow night, men he had trusted were going to do a thing they believed was certain, in a house they believed was empty on a timeline they believed was secret. And they were going to find instead the full weight of everything Walter Ainsley had spent half a century learning how to bring to bear, waiting for them in the dark. He had walked out of a conference room 36 hours ago, a man who had everything and saw almost none of it. He was going to walk into Friday, a man who had nearly lost all of it, and who had finally, at 71 years old, begun to understand what the having had been for. Get some sleep, he told the boy gently. Tomorrow's a long day. Caleb looked up from his drawing, his dark eyes steady in the lamplight. Are we going to stop them? He asked. Walter looked at the child who had run 14 blocks through the cold to save the life of a stranger, and he felt the last of the old doubt burn away and something harder and cleaner take its place. Yes, he said, we are. Friday came the way bad days always come, quietly on schedule, indifferent to whatever men had planned to do inside it. Walter Ainsley had not slept much. He had lain awake in the dark of the suite listening to the building breathe around him, and he had done what he had always done before the largest days of his life. He had gone through it. Every piece, every person, every place a thing could go wrong. He had built his whole career on the understanding that the difference between winning and losing was usually decided in the hours before anyone else even thought the contest had begun. By 4 in the morning, he was up and dressed. By 5, Harlan was beside him at the window, and the city below was still dark, the streetlights holding their small territories against the night, the lake a black nothing beyond the edge of the shoreline. Brenner's people are in position, Harlan said quietly. 3 locations: the estate, Marlene's residence, Vance's offices downtown. All at once, Walter said. 6 o'clock, all at once. Harlan paused. Nobody moves on any of them until then. The second one phone rings out of order, the whole thing could scatter. So we wait. Walter nodded. He had spent his life waiting for the right minute to close a thing. He knew how to do this, but he had never waited on anything that felt remotely like this. He thought about his house out in Winnetka, dark and quiet in the cold, with Dale Whitmore somewhere on the grounds in his red jacket, believing this was the day everything paid off. He thought about Marlene Voss asleep in her bed across the city, 11 years of trust gone rotten, believing that by tonight it would all be over and the debt would finally be settled. He thought about Sterling Vance, whom he had never once met, asleep somewhere, believing he had found at last the result that would clear his board and save him. None of them knew that a 10-year-old boy had run 14 blocks through the cold 3 days ago. None of them knew that the whole careful machine they had built was about to come down on their heads at 6 o'clock in the morning. Where's the boy? Walter asked. Still sleeping, Harlan said. I checked 20 minutes ago. Walter looked toward the dark doorway of the connecting room. Good, he said. Let him sleep. He's done his part. He doesn't need to be awake for ours. The minutes went by the way minutes go by when a man is counting them one at a time. At 10 minutes to 6, Sutton called. The warrants were signed. The agents were staged. Brenner himself was leading the team that would go through the service gate of Walter's own estate, the same gate that had opened 47 times in the dark over the past 3 weeks without ever once tripping an alarm. At 5 minutes to 6, the suite was completely silent. Walter stood at the window with his hands folded behind his back, looking out at the city that was just beginning to gray at its eastern edge, and he waited. At 6 o'clock, exactly 3 doors came open across the city of Chicago. Walter did not see any of it. That had been a deliberate thing decided 2 nights before. He was not present for a single arrest. There were reasons of safety and reasons of law, and a deeper reason that he had not spoken aloud to anyone, which was simply that he did not want to watch. He had spent 50 years building things up. He took no pleasure in watching things come apart, even things that deserved to come apart, especially things that had once been trust. But the phone calls came in one after another in the half hour that followed, and Harlan relayed each one in his flat, careful voice. The estate first. Federal agents through the service gate at 6 on the dot. Dale Whitmore taken on the grounds without a struggle, the red jacket and all with equipment in the maintenance vehicle that matched everything Adeline's server had captured. The house itself secured, and inside it in the basement, near the heating system, the early stages of exactly the thing the forensics men had warned about. Documented now, photographed, real and undeniable, and witnessed by federal agents instead of erased forever in a fireball. Then Marlene's residence. She had not run. There had been nowhere to run to. 11 years of managing the space between Walter Ainsley and the world, and in the end the world had simply arrived at her own door at 6 in the morning. Harlan said the report described her as quiet, that she had not seemed surprised, that a woman who had spent over a year sliding deeper into a thing she could not climb out of had perhaps somewhere underneath all of it been waiting for this particular morning as much as she had been dreading it. Then Vance. The offices downtown, the financing records, the connections that the forensic trail had opened up into a network far larger than one dead businessman would ever have closed. Sterling Vance arrested at his home, and with him, the beginning of something the federal side had been wanting a thread into for a long time. Walter's case, it turned out, was not just Walter's case. It was a door into a much larger house than any of them had known was standing there. By 6:30, it was done. The thing that had been coming for Walter Ainsley by Friday night had instead come apart at 6 o'clock Friday morning, the same day hours ahead of its own deadline, in a sequence so clean and so complete that no lawyer Sterling Vance could ever afford would pull a single thread of it loose. Harlan set down the phone for the last time and looked at Walter across the quiet suite. "It's over," he said. "All three. It's done." Walter stood at the window a moment longer. Out beyond the glass, the sun was finally coming up over the lake. Gray and then pale gold, the cold light of an October morning, spreading slowly across a city that had no idea what had nearly happened in it, and no idea what had just been stopped. He felt the thing he always felt at the close of a long deal. Not joy, something quieter and steadier than that. The feeling of a thing concluded. But underneath it this time, there was something he had not felt at the close of a deal in many years. He could not have named it precisely. It was something between grief and gratitude. The weight of how close it had all come. The strangeness of being alive in the morning light, when by every plan of every man who had wished him dead, he should not have been. He turned from the window. "Where's the boy?" he said. Caleb was awake. He had come to the doorway sometime in the last few minutes, drawn by the low voices, and he stood there now in his worn clothes, watching the two men with those dark, steady eyes. "Is it done?" the boy asked. Walter looked at him for a long moment. "It's done," he said. "They didn't get the chance. Because of you." Caleb took this in without his face moving, much a boy who had learned to feel a large thing without showing it to anyone. But something flickered behind his eyes. Relief, maybe. Or the simple settling of a weight he had been carrying alone for 3 days and 3 nights. "Then can we go see my grandmother?" he said. And of all the things Walter Ainsley might have done that morning, of all the places a man in his position might have gone the calls, he could have taken the press, he could have summoned the long-deserved reckoning, he could have stood and watched unfold. He did the one thing the boy asked. "Yes," he said, "we can go see your grandmother." The shelter on Wabash sat in the shadow of an old church, a plain brick building that had been many things before it was ever this. Walter had Tony drive them, and he sat in the back of the SUV beside the boy as the morning city moved past the windows, the same city that had nearly taken everything from him, looking ordinary and gray and entirely unaware of any of it. Caleb was quiet most of the way. Then a few blocks out, he said, "She's going to ask where I've been." "Yes," Walter said. "She is." "What do I tell her?" Walter thought about it. "The truth," he said. "She earned it. So did you." They went in through a side door into a common room with folding tables and folding chairs and the smell of weak coffee and old radiators. And there at a table near the window sat Eleanor Ridgway. She was 67 years old. She was thin in the way of people whose health has been quietly taking things from them year by year, more than they ever let on to anyone. But she sat upright, and her eyes were clear, and when the door opened and her grandson came through it, she stood from her chair with the steady decisiveness of a woman who does not waste motion on uncertainty. She crossed the room and took the boy into her arms. It was the embrace of a woman who had been not worrying all night in the particular way that is indistinguishable from worrying. She held him, and then she stepped back and looked him over with a hard, assessing gaze, the look of a woman who needs to confirm with her own two eyes that a person is whole and will not simply take their word for it. Then she looked up past the boy at Walter. She looked at the old man standing in the doorway, and something moved across her face. Recognition slowly arriving. She had seen that face before, on the television in this very room, on the covers of magazines. "You're the man he warned," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Walter said. She looked at him for a long moment with the gaze of a woman who had spent 31 years reading second graders who had developed across all those years the ability to see past what a person was presenting and straight into what they actually were. Walter had been read by sharp men in hard rooms his entire life. He had rarely felt as fully seen as he felt under the eyes of Eleanor Ridgway in that shabby common room. "Thank you," she said at last, "for keeping him safe." "He kept me safe," Walter said. "I was only trying to return the favor." Something complicated moved through Eleanor's face, and she managed it with the practiced composure of a woman who had long ago decided that certain feelings were private and would stay that way. She looked down at her grandson and then back up at Walter. "Sit down," she said. "The coffee here is not very good, but it's hot." And Walter Ainsley, who that very morning had been spared an unmarked grave, sat down at a folding table in a homeless shelter and drank bad coffee with a retired schoolteacher and could not remember the last time he had felt so squarely in the right place in all the world. They talked, or Eleanor and Walter talked, while Caleb ate a piece of toast and listened with that complete attention he brought to everything. She told him in pieces the shape of how they had come to be there. She had taught second grade for 31 years, the year she said, when reading stops being decoding and becomes reading, the most important year in a child's whole intellectual life, and the year she had chosen on purpose for exactly that reason. She had retired 3 years ago when her heart had finally insisted on it. Her husband had died 4 years before that, and her daughter, the boy's mother, had died 18 months ago in the sudden and terrible way that had left Caleb in her care and had set in motion the slow financial unraveling that ends eventually in a rotating bed at a shelter on Wabash. She did not tell it as a tragedy. She told it as a sequence of facts, the way a person tells a thing they have decided not to be destroyed by. And Walter, listening, understood at last where the boy's particular steadiness had come from. It had come from this woman. The learned calm of people who have survived hard things by simply deciding to survive them one day at a time, without ever once asking the world for sympathy, it was not going to give them anyway. "He told you about our situation," Eleanor said at one point. "It was not an accusation. He told me where you were and that you were safe," Walter said. "The rest I asked about." Eleanor looked at her grandson. "And you've been sleeping in that building," she said, "behind this man's house." Caleb looked down at his toast. "It was dry," he said. "Caleb. And it was warm. There was a vent." He said it the way a boy defends a sensible decision, not the way a boy apologizes for a foolish one. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Walter and her eyes were steady and clear, and for just a moment, very tired. "He has never once in his life done a thing without a reason," she said. "Even when he was very small. If he did something, it was because he had thought it all the way through first." She paused. "I imagine sleeping in an abandoned building was the best option he could find." "It's how he was able to warn me," Walter said. "I know," she said. "I understand that part." She held his gaze. "What I do not understand is why it was his best option in the first place." And Walter Ainsley, who had spent 50 years having an answer ready for everything, held the old woman's eyes and gave her the only honest thing he had. "I've been thinking about that since Wednesday night," he said. "I don't have a good answer for you, but I have been thinking about it, and I'm not going to stop." Eleanor looked at him for the long moment of a woman deciding whether a thing she has just been told is true or only kind. Then she nodded once slightly, the nod of a person who has decided that it is true. What happened in the weeks that followed was not a single dramatic event. It was a series of decisions, which is how all lasting things in the world get built. The legal process moved with the heavy momentum that federal cases develop when the evidence is overwhelming and the chief witness is fully willing. Marlene Voss entered a plea. Garrett Holloway cooperated in exchange for a reduced charge, and what he gave up widened the case further still. Dale Whitmore's testimony tied the operation to Sterling Vance's network in ways that opened doors the federal side had been pushing against for years. Vance himself faced the full weight of it, the murder for hire at the center of the thing, and the rot of his financing all around the edges. Walter cooperated completely. He sat for the interviews. He turned over every file from Adeline's server. He gave the case the same total focus he had given to the largest deals of his life, and in doing so, he helped close not just the door that had nearly closed on him, but several others besides. And then on a Sunday morning in late October, he went home. He walked through the rooms of the big house in Winnetka, the house that was supposed to have been his tomb. And he walked through it slowly, noticing things. The particular way the morning light came in low through the kitchen windows. The specific creak of the third stair. The small, ordinary qualities of a place that a man only truly sees once he has understood that he very nearly would not have been alive to see any of them at all. He had called Eleanor the morning after the arrests. He had gone to the shelter and sat across from her in the common room and said a thing he had been turning over for days. "I want to help," he had told her, "but I want to do it in a way that is actually useful, not in a way that just makes me feel better about myself for having wanted to. So I need you to tell me what is genuinely needed. The real things, not the things I'd guess at from the outside." Eleanor Ridgway had looked at him for a long moment with that second-grade teacher's gaze. "That," she had said, "is the most sensible thing anyone has said to me in 6 months." And then she had told him. It was not a list of grand gestures. It was a list of ordinary structural things. Continuity of medical care for a failing heart. Stable housing that did not rotate out from under you every 2 weeks. The simple, enormous gift of a boy staying in one school long enough for the school to learn who he was. The plain infrastructure of an ordinary life, which had become unavailable to them, not through any failing of anyone's character, but through the cold arithmetic of loss compounding on loss until there was nothing left to stand on. Walter addressed the list. He did not do it dramatically. He did it the way he did everything that mattered, with systematic focus coordinating the moving parts toward a single outcome. Because that was the one thing he knew how to do better than almost anyone alive. And this situation called for exactly that. He knew an excellent cardiologist, a man who owed him a favor of long standing, and he called the favor in. Within a week, Eleanor Ridgway had care that did not depend on which shelter happened to have a bed that night. He knew the director of a foundation that held a portfolio of affordable housing, and he made a single call that produced a 2-bedroom apartment in Evanston, near a school with a strong math program, because Caleb had mentioned during one of those long nights in the hotel that he was good at math and curious about how buildings were designed. Walter had filed that detail away in the particular folder of his mind reserved for the things that mattered, and now he took it out and used it. He established an educational fund, but he did not structure it as charity because he had understood from watching the boy hesitate over a plate of food on that first cold night that charity was a thing Caleb's pride could not easily accept. He structured it as a scholarship run through a foundation he endowed for the purpose open to other children in situations like Caleb's, so that what the boy received was not exceptional treatment that set him apart from everyone, but simply first access to a thing that now existed for many. Eleanor had suggested that framing. Walter had recognized at once that it was right. And he hired Eleanor, not as a gesture, as a hire. Walter had been involved for years in a Chicago literacy program that had been struggling for a year and a half to find someone with both the classroom expertise and the steady hand to run its tutoring effort. Eleanor Ridgway had 31 years of classroom expertise and the kind of organizational steadiness that gets forged in a woman who has held a whole family together while keeping a second grader believing that the world is full of things worth learning. She started in November. Within 3 months, the program's director told Walter it was the best hire the initiative had made in a decade. Caleb started school in November in Evanston in the 5th grade where he belonged. His teacher had been told that he was a boy who had been through disruption, who would need some time to settle, and who once settled was likely to surprise everyone around him. He did not need as much time as they expected. He was, as Eleanor had always known, and as Walter could now see for himself, a boy who paid attention to things and remembered what he learned and used what he remembered with a consistency that made disruption less of a wall to him than it was to children who had never had his hard education in what attention was actually for. Walter went to the school's winter program in December. He sat in the gymnasium among the other parents and guardians, an old man on a folding chair in a coat that cost more than some of them made in a month, and watched the 5th grade perform a short piece about the history of Chicago. Caleb had a speaking part, 3 sentences delivered with that composed, deliberate quality that Walter had come to recognize as simply the boy's nature. Eleanor sat 2 seats to Walter's left, and her face watching her grandson up on that small stage was the face of a woman watching something she had fought very hard to still be alive to see. Afterward, in the corridor outside the gym, Caleb came over to where Walter stood. "You came," the boy said. "I said I would," Walter said. Caleb looked at him for a moment with those clear, assessing eyes. "I have a question," he said. "Go ahead." "The building I was sleeping in," Caleb said. "Behind your house. Is it still there?" "Yes," Walter said. "I haven't touched it." Caleb nodded slowly, working at something behind his eyes. I've been thinking about what to do with it, he said. Walter looked at the boy. What have you come up with? I thought it could be for kids, Caleb said. Not for sleeping, just a place they could go, if they needed somewhere to be. He paused, building the idea out loud with the care he brought to things he was still in the middle of thinking through. A lot of kids don't have anywhere to go after school or on weekends when things are bad at home. I know how to make a space work if you have the right materials and you're not afraid of a little work. He stopped. I don't mean I'd do it. I mean it could be done by somebody. Walter looked at him for a long moment. That's a good idea, he said. I know, Caleb said, not arrogantly, just with the plain honesty of a boy who has thought something all the way through and is confident in the thinking. I think we should take it further, Walter said. I think we should sit down with your grandmother and figure out what it would actually require. What a real version of it would look like standing up in the world. Caleb nodded. Saturday, he said. Grandma makes lunch on Saturdays. You could come. I'll come, Walter said. He came on Saturday, and many Saturdays after that. And the idea grew the way good ideas grow when the people growing them each bring something the others lack. Caleb brought his precision, his eye for how a space worked and what it needed. Eleanor brought 31 years of understanding what a child requires from a place that is meant to be safe. And Walter brought the one thing he had spent 53 years learning, which was how to take an idea and make it real and built and lasting out where other people could lean against it. The maintenance building was renovated over the following spring. It was a project that Caleb had opinions about and was allowed to have opinions about every step of the way. And it opened in June of the following year, a community space run by Walter's Foundation, with Eleanor Ridgway as its program director, and with a name that had been the boy's own suggestion, and that Walter, the moment he heard it, had known was exactly right. The Ridgway Center, named for a woman who had spent 31 years teaching second graders that the world was full of things worth learning, and whose one particular lesson about wrong and silence and the weight of staying quiet had produced in a boy sleeping in a cold building one October the decision to run 14 blocks through a crowd to stop a thing from happening. The center opened on a Tuesday in June. There were no magazine covers. Walter did not call the press. Eleanor said she preferred it that way, and Walter agreed, and Caleb said that the opening should be for the kids who would use the place, not for the people who had built it, which was exactly the kind of thing Caleb said. The three of them stood in front of the building in the June morning light. It was renovated now, warm-colored, with a garden that Caleb had designed with the help of a landscape architect who had given his time at Walter's request. It's a good building, Eleanor said. It'll be better when there are kids in it, Caleb said. Walter said nothing for a moment. He was thinking about a cold October evening and a boy in a worn jacket with a separated shoe running against the flow of a crowd because he had heard something in the dark and decided it mattered. He was thinking about Adeline's server in the third stair in his house and a folding table in a shelter where the coffee was not very good but was hot. He was thinking about the strange, quiet way the whole course of a life can change. Not in one great moment, however much it sometimes seems that way afterward, but in the slow accumulation of small moments, each one, the result of a person deciding to pay attention to what was right in front of him instead of what was easy. He looked at the boy. Caleb was studying the building with the expression of someone checking whether a thing he imagined matches the thing that now exists in front of him. Does it match? Walter asked. Caleb considered it carefully. Pretty much, he said. I thought the windows would be a little bigger. We can make the windows bigger, Walter said. I know, Caleb said. I'm just saying. Eleanor made a sound that was not quite a laugh but held everything a laugh holds. And Walter Ainsley, 71 years old, stood there in the June sun and felt the cold October morning recalled to him across all those months, standing right alongside the warm June morning that was happening now. And he understood that these were the same story told from its two opposite ends, and that the whole distance between them had been crossed by a 10-year-old boy in a worn jacket who had made one decision in the dark based on something his grandmother had taught him about what wrong becomes when you stay silent. The wrong had not become part of the boy. The right had instead. And the lives of two people, three people, four. If you counted Eleanor's heart doctor, who would later describe her as the most demanding and ultimately most rewarding patient he had treated in 20 years, were now organized around an entirely different future than the one October had been quietly preparing for them all. Some buildings protect people through their walls and their systems, and the whole architecture of security. Walter Ainsley had spent half a century building those. He was good at it. He intended to go right on being good at it. But the most important building he had ever been any part of was a renovated maintenance structure at the edge of a tree line in Winnetka, Illinois, named for a retired second-grade teacher who had taught a boy that silence has a weight and that a man has to decide well in advance whether he is willing to carry it. Caleb Ridgway had decided in advance. He had decided that he could not carry it, which, as it turned out, was exactly the right thing to decide. The three of them stood together in the morning light a while longer, looking at the building that had once been a hiding place for a frightened boy and was now a door held open for every child who would ever need somewhere to go. And then they went inside to get it ready for the kids.